The rain started at midnight. Sarah heard it before she saw it, the first drops against the stone windowsill of her room, the room that had been hers for 3 years now, the room at the end of the east corridor that was not the Alpha King's room and had never been and would never be, apparently, because that was the arrangement. That was what 3 years had taught her with the particular patience of something that does not need to announce itself. It simply accumulates, day by day, until you stop expecting anything different. She was sitting at the window when it started. She sat at the window most evenings, because the window faced the forest, and the forest did not look at her the way the palace did, with that specific quality of awareness that came from living inside a building full of people who knew something about her situation and had decided, collectively, to pretend they did not. The forest simply was, trees and dark, and the occasional sound of wind in the upper branches, and now rain, coming in fast from the north the way it did in the mountain territories when the season was turning. Not gently but all at once, a decision made by weather without consultation. She pulled the window closed. She stood in the center of her room and listened to the rain against the glass and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she had developed over 3 years of evenings, exactly like this one. The trick was to let the mind go wide rather than deep. Wide meant the rain and the glass and the fire burning low in the grate, and the book she had not been reading on the table beside the chair. Deep meant Caden, and she had learned in the first year that deep was a direction she could not afford to travel without a cost she was not always willing to pay. She had been 18 when they married. He had been 29, which was not old, was in fact quite young for an Alpha King who had been ruling for 6 years already, but which had felt, to her at 18, like a distance she could not calculate. Not in years. In something else. In the specific gravity of a person who had already decided who he was and arranged his life accordingly and did not require anything from the arrangement except its continuation. She had not known, at 18, that a person could be in a room with someone every day and be entirely alone. She knew it now. She knew it the way you know things that have been true long enough to stop feeling like information and start feeling like weather, simply the condition of your life, the thing you dress for each morning without thinking about why the temperature is what it is. The fire needed wood. She crossed to the basket beside the grate and added 2 pieces and watched the new flames catch and thought about whether she was hungry, decided she was not, decided she probably was, but that hunger was easier to ignore than to address at this hour, when addressing it meant ringing for someone and explaining herself. She did not like explaining herself at this hour. She did not like explaining herself generally, which was possibly part of the problem, or part of what she had come to think of as the problem, though she had been honest enough with herself over 3 years to admit that naming it a problem required deciding whose problem it was, and that was a calculation she had stopped making somewhere in year 2 because it produced the same answer every time. And the answer was not useful. She was 21 now. She had been the Alpha King's wife for 3 years, and in those 3 years he had been courteous and distant and present at every public function and absent from everything else. He did not come to her room. He had not come to her room since the first month, and what had happened in that first month was something she kept in a particular compartment of her mind, stored carefully, visited rarely, because visiting it produced a feeling she could not afford to feel on a regular basis, which was something close to grief for a thing she had almost had and then watched recede. She knew why it had receded. She thought she knew. She had never asked directly, and he had never explained directly, and the space between those 2 silences had become, over 3 years, the defining architecture of their marriage. The fire was better now. She went back to the chair and picked up the book and opened it and read the same paragraph 3 times without retaining a word. The rain was heavier. She could hear it in the stones of the palace itself, the way old stone carried weather. A low resonance that was almost musical, if you were in the right state of mind, which she was not. She was in the state of mind that came at the end of a day that had contained a formal dinner at which she and Caden had sat at the same long table for 2 hours and exchanged perhaps 4 sentences, all of them administrative, all of them conducted with the specific politeness of 2 people who have agreed, without agreeing, to be strangers who share a roof. She was in the state of mind that followed that kind of evening like a shadow follows a body, faithful and unavoidable and entirely without warmth. She closed the book. She looked at the fire. She thought. 3 years. And then she thought, what is the point of thinking 3 years as if it is an answer rather than just a number? And then she thought about the rain and the forest and the way the first month had felt, briefly, like something was beginning. And she put that thought back in its compartment and closed it and sat with her hands in her lap and waited for the evening to become late enough to justify going to sleep. The knock, when it came, was so unexpected that she did not process it as a knock for a full 2 seconds. She processed it as the rain, as the window, as some sound the palace made in storms. Then it came again, and she stood, and she crossed to the door, and she opened it. Caden was standing in the corridor. He was wet. Not slightly damp, not the kind of wet that comes from walking quickly between 2 covered spaces. He was wet the way a person gets when they have been outside in serious rain without a cloak, his dark hair flattened against his forehead, his shirt dark with it, his jaw carrying a line of water that ran down to his collar. He was also not wearing his formal clothes, which was the second thing she noticed. He was in the clothes he wore when he rode out alone, plain dark shirt, riding trousers, boots that were now leaving a wet mark on the corridor stone. He looked like himself, but not the version of himself she saw at dinners and council gatherings. He looked like the version of himself she had seen briefly, very briefly, in the first month, before he had put the other version back on and kept it on ever since. She said nothing. She was too surprised to say anything immediately, and she had learned, over 3 years, that speaking from surprise produced words she later had to account for, so she had trained herself to wait until she knew what she was actually saying. He said, "The east stable roof collapsed." She waited. He said, "3 horses are loose in the lower field. I need." He stopped. He looked at her standing in the doorway in her nightgown, with the fire behind her and the rain loud against the corridor windows, and something in his expression did the thing it almost never did in her presence, which was shift. Not much. A very small movement. Like a door that has been locked so long the lock has partially fused and cannot open fully, but can be moved, slightly, with enough pressure. He said, "I apologize. I should not have knocked." She said, "You need help with the horses." He said, "I needed the stable master's room number." I couldn't remember which. He stopped again. She had the distinct impression he remembered perfectly well which room the stable master was in, and that this was not actually why he had knocked on her door at midnight in the rain. She did not say this. She said, "It's the 3rd room past the south staircase, landing on the ground floor." He said, "Yes, that's right." He did not move. She looked at him standing in the corridor, the size of him, Caden, who was built the way Alpha Kings were built, broad through the shoulder, a physical authority that required no announcement, standing in the corridor of his own palace, in soaking wet riding clothes, looking at her with an expression she had filed away in the compartment and was apparently going to have to take out and look at again. She said, "Come in." He said, "I'm wet." She said, "I can see that. Come in." He came in. She closed the door behind him. The room felt different immediately with him in it, not smaller exactly, but rearranged, the way a space rearranges itself around a presence that is larger than its usual contents. He had been in this room before, He knew its dimensions. But she had the sense he was looking at it as if learning it again from the beginning. The fire and the chair and the book face down on the table, and the window streaming with rain. She went to the wardrobe and found the blanket she kept on the upper shelf and brought it back and held it out. He looked at it. She said, "You're going to be cold in a wet shirt." He took the blanket. He did not put it around his shoulders immediately. He held it in his large hands and looked at it as if it were a moderately complex document requiring consideration. She almost said something about this, and then did not. She went and sat in her chair by the fire and left him to decide what to do with the blanket. He put it around his shoulders. He stood for a moment in the middle of her room with the blanket around him, and his wet hair, and his careful face, and she thought he looked, for the first time in 3 years, like a person rather than a position. He said, "I'll send for the stable master." She said, "Sit down first." He looked at the other chair. The 2 chairs faced each other across the fireplace. He had not sat in that chair before. Nobody had. She had bought it when she arranged the room, 2 chairs, because she had been 18 and optimistic, and she had not yet understood the architecture of the silence she was moving into. He sat. The fire was between them, low and warm, and the rain was loud on the windows, and she looked at him sitting in the chair that had never been sat in, and felt something move in her chest that she had been careful not to feel for a long time, and was apparently not going to be able to avoid feeling tonight. She said, "How many horses?" He said, 3. He paused. Probably just 2. Mira stays close to the stable in rain. She knows the way back. He said this the way people say things about animals they have spent real time with the specific texture of knowledge that comes from attention. She had not known he knew the horses' names and habits. She had not known because they did not talk about things like that. They did not talk about most things. She said, "I didn't know you rode out alone at night." He said, "Sometimes," when he stopped. She waited. He said, "When the council has been difficult." She nodded. She looked at the fire. She thought about 3 years of difficult council days and where he had gone on all of them, and that she had not known. She thought about how much you could not know about a person you lived with when you had both agreed, without agreeing, to maintain a particular distance. She said, "Is the roof badly damaged?" He said, "The beam gave. It will need replacing." He paused. It was not maintained the way it should have been. Something in his voice when he said that, something with a different weight than the words required, and she glanced at him, and he was looking at the fire, and his expression was doing the complicated thing again, the thing that had made her open the door wider when she should perhaps have simply given him the room number and closed it again. She should perhaps have done that. She had not done that. She was sitting by her own fire at midnight with her husband in a chair that had never been sat in, and the rain was saying everything neither of them was saying, and she thought, 3 years is a long time to maintain a distance. She thought, something is different tonight. She did not know yet what to do with either of those thoughts. He did not leave after the first hour. She had expected him to. She had constructed, while they sat in their respective chairs and the fire burned between them, a quiet internal timeline in which he warmed up and remembered the stable, master and excused himself with the specific politeness he deployed like armor, and went back to his side of the palace where everything was, arranged the way he had arranged it, and nothing required anything of him that he had not already agreed to provide. He did not follow this timeline. He stayed, and they talked, which was not something they did. Not like this. Not about anything real. It started with the horses. She asked about Mira, the one he said knew the way back, and he told her, without much preamble, that Mira was the oldest horse in the stable and had been there since before he became king, had belonged to his father, and that she had a habit of standing in the exact center of her stall and regarding visitors with an expression of comprehensive judgment. Sarah said, "That sounds familiar." He looked at her. She had not meant to say it. It had come out of the part of her that had been sitting in this room alone for 3 years and had therefore not had adequate opportunity to filter itself. She waited for him to receive it badly, to close, to reach for the politeness. He said, "Is that what I look like?" She said, "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. She waited, holding herself carefully, not sure where this was going or whether she had just ended the evening. He said, "I have been told that before." She said, "By who?" He said, "My brother." Before he left for the Northern Territory, he paused. He said it more directly than you did. Sarah said, "I was being diplomatic." Something happened in his expression. Very small. The thing she had filed away and taken out again. She looked at the fire. Outside, the rain was still insistent, still making its case against every surface of the palace, and she thought, "I have sat in this room for 3 years, and tonight the rain came, and something shifted, and I do not know what it is or what to do with it, but I am not going to close the window on it the way I have closed other things." She said, "Why did you really knock on my door?" She said it without looking at him, which was a deliberate choice, giving him the easier angle. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer, which would have been very much like him, and she would have understood it and filed it away with the other things. Then he said, "I was in the East Corridor." She waited. He said, "I walk the East Corridor sometimes." At night. She looked at him then. She could not help it. He was looking at the fire, his profile to her, the blanket still around his shoulders, and his face was in the careful mode but with something underneath it that the careful mode was doing less than its usual job of concealing. She said, "How often?" He said, "Often enough." She said, "And tonight, you knocked." He said, "Tonight the light was under your door." He looked at her when he said it, turned from the fire to look directly at her, and she held it, the looking, the way she had not held something from him in a very long time, because he had not offered something to hold in a very long time. She said, "The light is always under my door at this hour." He said, "I know." She said, "You've been walking past for 3 years." He said, very quietly, "Yes." The fire made a small sound, the wood settling, and the rain made its sound, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not the silence she was used to, which was the silence of 2 people maintaining a distance. This was a different silence. This was the silence that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and both people are sitting with the size of it. She said, "Why didn't you knock before tonight?" She asked it without anger, genuinely, because she wanted to understand and because she had spent 3 years not asking, and tonight seemed like the night to be done with that. He said, "Because I didn't know what to do once you opened the door." She looked at him. He was looking back. She thought about 18, and the first month, and the thing that had almost been and then receded, and she thought about the East Corridor, and the light under the door, and a man walking past the same door for 3 years, and not knocking. And she felt something that was not grief. Not exactly, something adjacent to it but warmer, something that had not been there an hour ago. She said, "And now?" He said, "I still don't know." She said, "You're here." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's a start." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was warm. The rain had not stopped. Neither of them moved from their chairs, and she did not expect them to. Not tonight. Not yet. Because, whatever this was, it was fragile, in the specific way of things that have been kept at distance for a long time, and are only now being allowed to be closer. But he was here. and she had opened the door, and he had not left after the first hour, and the chair that had never been sat in had someone in it, and she thought, 3 years. And then she thought, tonight, and the distance between those two things was enormous, and was also, possibly, the exact distance two people had to cross to get from where they had been to somewhere worth being. He came back the next evening. Not in the rain this time. Not wet. Not in riding clothes. Not with a pretext about horses or a collapsed roof. He came at the same hour, just past 10, and knocked the same way, 2 knocks, and when she opened the door he was in his plain clothes again, the ones without ceremony, and he said nothing by way of explanation. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She went to her chair. He went to his. The fire was already lit. She had lit it earlier than usual. She did not examine that fact too carefully. They sat and she picked up her book, and he had brought something of his own, a folded document she could not identify from across the fire, and for a while they simply occupied the same room in the way of two people who have agreed, finally, on a different arrangement than the one they have been keeping. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. 2 chairs and a fire and rain still coming, and going outside and the quiet of the palace around them. But it was different from every evening that had come before it in 3 years, and the difference was not small. She read. He read his document. At some point, she said, without planning to, "Is that the Eastern Trade Report?" He looked up. She said, "The figures on the left margin. I can see them from here." He looked at the document and then at her. He said, "You can read figures from that distance." She said, "I used to help my father with his accounts. He was a merchant. The figures get into your eyes after a while." He said, "Yes, it's the Eastern Trade Report." He paused. "There's a discrepancy I can't account for." She said, "What kind?" He said, "The transport levy is recorded at 2 different rates in the same quarter. 1 rate in the collector's summary and a different rate in the village returns." She said, "Which is higher?" He said, "The collector's." She said, "Then the collector is skimming." He was very still. She said, "It's the most common form. The collector records a higher rate to the palace and pockets the difference. It's difficult to catch without the village returns because most administrators only read the summary." He said, "How do you know this?" She said, "My father was a merchant in the border territories for 20 years. I grew up watching him read reports that way, both documents against each other." He looked at the document. He looked at her. He said, "Have you seen this in other reports?" She said, "I haven't read the palace reports." He said, "After a moment, would you?" She looked at him across the fire. She said, "You're asking me to read your administrative reports." He said, "I'm asking if you're willing to." She thought about 3 years of evenings in this room with nothing to do but the book she had not been reading. She said yes. He stood and brought the document to her. He did not hand it across the fire and go back to his chair. He pulled the small table between them and set it down, and she leaned forward, and he stood beside her, and she pointed to the discrepancy and explained the mechanism, and he listened with complete attention. The same quality of attention she had seen last night, when she had said things she did not plan to say, and he had received them without deflection. His attention was, she found, a significant thing. When he applied it, it was like a change in light, everything becoming more visible. She said, "You need the last 4 quarters of village returns from this district." He said, "I'll have them sent to." He stopped. She looked up at him. He said, "Where would you like them sent?" She said, "Here." "In the morning?" He said yes. He went back to his chair. She kept the document. They read in the same room until past midnight, and the fire burned down, and she added wood without thinking about it, and he watched her do it with the expression she was starting to be able to read. The one that was not composed in the way his public face was composed. The one with something real moving underneath it. When he left, he paused at the door. He said, "Sarah." It was the first time he had said her name, and she could not remember. She could not remember the last time he had said her name in a room alone with her. She said, "Yes." He said, "The chair." Last night, he stopped, finding the words with visible effort, as if the words required more from him than words usually did. He said it should have been used long before now. She held his gaze. She said, "Yes, it should have." He said goodnight and left, and she sat in her chair and looked at the fire and felt the thing she had been careful not to feel moving through her with no regard at all for her carefulness, large and warm and frightening, in the specific way that good things are frightening when you have been without them long enough to have stopped believing in them. She picked up the trade report. She read it twice more. She found a second discrepancy on the third page that she had missed the first time, and she wrote it in the margin in her own hand, and she put the document on the small table between the chairs, where he would see it in the morning if he came, and she thought, "He will come." She thought this without the qualification she had been applying to everything for 3 years, the yes but, and the probably not, and the don't expect. She thought it plainly, as fact. He will come. She went to sleep, which was something she had not done easily in a long time, and she slept without the usual wakefulness, the 3 a.m., accounting of everything she was not and did not have, and in the morning there was a stack of 4 quarters of village returns on the table beside the door, and she had not heard anyone bring them, and she sat down with her tea and started reading. The discrepancy was larger than either of them had thought. It took her 3 days to work through all 4 quarters of village returns, cross-referencing each against the collector's summaries, building a ledger in the notebook she had been using for household accounts because it was the only notebook she had with enough pages. By the end of the 3rd day, she had documented 11 separate instances of rate manipulation across 6 villages, all in the same district, all under the same collector's jurisdiction, totaling an amount that was significant enough that she set her pen down and looked at the numbers for a while before she was ready to tell him. He had been coming every evening. That was now simply true, a fact of the days the way the fire in the evening was a fact, something that happened without requiring a decision each time. He sat in the chair, and she sat in her chair, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they read, and sometimes she showed him something in the reports, and he listened with the complete attention that she had stopped being surprised by and started being, quietly and without announcing it, grateful for. On the 4th evening she showed him the ledger. He sat beside her, not across the fire, beside her at the writing desk, and read through what she had built, and she watched his face while he read it. He read carefully. He read the way she had learned he did most things, without hurry, with the specific focus of someone who understood that speed in the wrong direction was worse than patience. He finished. He said, "This is thorough." She said, "It's accurate. I checked everything twice." He said, "I know it's accurate." He looked at the numbers again. He said, "This has been happening for," she said, "at least 4 years based on the pattern, possibly longer if the earlier records show the same variation." He said, "I'll need to go back further." She said, "I'll need more village returns." He looked at her. There was something in the expression, something with several layers in it. He said, "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." She held his gaze. She said, "I want to." He said nothing for a moment. She could see him receiving that, the "I want to," receiving it the way he received things that mattered, with the full attention that was his particular form of care. He said, "Why?" she said. "Because it's wrong. The villages are being stolen from." And because she stopped, he waited. She said, "Because I have been in this palace for 3 years and this is the first thing that has felt like it matters what I do with my time." He was very still. She had not meant to say that. Or she had meant to say it eventually, but not tonight. Not at the writing desk with the ledger between them. But she had said it, and she was not going to take it back, because it was true, and she had decided, somewhere in the second day of reading The Village Returns with her tea going cold beside her, that she was done taking true things back for the sake of smoothness. He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I have known for a long time that the arrangement was—" He stopped. She waited. She was very good at waiting now. She had 3 years of practice. He said that the arrangement was not what I intended when I another stop. She said, "When you stopped coming to this room." He looked at her. She looked back. She said, "You can say it directly." "I'm not going to break." He said, "I know you're not going to break." His voice had something different in it when he said that. Something that was not quite an apology but was in the same territory. Something with weight behind it. He said, "I stopped because I thought he found the words with visible effort. I thought distance was simpler." She said, "Simpler than what?" He said, "Than wanting something I wasn't certain I had the right to want." She looked at the ledger. She looked at the fire. She looked at him sitting beside her at the desk she had been sitting at. Alone for 3 years, and she thought about the east corridor and the light under the door and a man who had been walking past for 3 years and calling it simpler, and she thought about 18 and the first month and what had briefly been and what had receded, and she thought, "This is the conversation we should have had 2.5 years ago." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I'm here." She said, "Yes." She said, "You are." She picked up her pen. She said, "I'll need the records from 4 years ago." He said, "I'll have them brought tomorrow." She said, "Good." She looked at the numbers in the ledger, and he looked at them beside her, and neither of them said anything else, and the fire burned, and the palace settled around them, and it was nothing like 3 years ago, and it was also, she thought, exactly right. She found the second collector on a Tuesday. She was not looking for a second collector. She was looking for the continuation of the first pattern, tracking the rate manipulation backward through the older records that had arrived in 2 large stacks on the table beside her door over the previous 4 days. And she was deep in the 3rd year of returns when she noticed that the district boundary in 1 quarter did not match the district boundary in the adjacent quarter, which should not have been possible because district boundaries did not change without a formal record, and she went looking for the formal record and could not find it, and then she went looking for the reason she could not find it, and that was how she found the second collector. Not manipulating rates. Redrawing lines. Moving villages between districts on paper to obscure the rate manipulation of the first collector, which meant the second collector knew about the first, which meant there were 2 of them, and possibly a third. Because in Sarah's experience, in the border merchant world her father had navigated for 20 years, this kind of arrangement rarely involved only 2 people. She was sitting with this when Caden came that evening. She could tell from the way he looked at her when he came in that something was visible on her face, some version of what she was thinking. He said, "What did you find?" She told him. He sat across from her at the desk, and she showed him the boundary discrepancy and walked him through the logic, and he followed it without difficulty, asking 2 questions at exactly the right moments, the moments where the argument required the most support. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. He said, "A coordinated system." She said, "At minimum 2 people. Probably 3. He said, "The district supervisor." She said, "That would be my guess." He nodded slowly. He said, "This is..." He paused. She said, "Bigger than we thought." He said, "Bigger than I thought." He looked at her. He said, "You thought bigger." She said, "I thought it was possible. I didn't want to say it before I had the boundary evidence." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I didn't want to tell you something alarming that turned out to be wrong." He held her gaze. He said, "You can tell me things that turn out to be wrong." She said, "I know that now." He said, "Did you not know it before?" She looked at the records. She said, "I didn't know what I could tell you, what you wanted to hear." What was she stopped? He said, quietly, "What was welcome?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he was going to file it away, the way she had learned he sometimes filed things that were too large to address directly, putting them in a pocket for later. But he did not file it. He said, "Everything is welcome." She looked at him. He said, "I should have said that long ago. I should have." He stopped. "Found it." He said, "I should have made it clear." She said, "Yes." She held his gaze, and she said it plainly, without anger, because she was not angry, not anymore, or not only angry. The anger had other things mixed into it now, warmer things, things that complicated the anger and made it harder to hold cleanly. She said, "You should have." He said, "I know." She said, "And now you are." He said, "Yes." She looked at the records. She said, "We need to find the third person." He said, "We." She said, "Yes, we." "I'm not stopping now." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting better at reading, the one with several layers, the one where the top layer was composure, and underneath it was something that had been wanting out for a long time. He said, "No." He said, "I didn't think you would." She almost smiled. She picked up her pen and went back to the records, and he pulled the district maps from the bottom of the stack she had been working through and spread them on the desk beside her, and they worked, side by side, into the late hours. And when Petra came to bring tea, Sarah did not look up, and when Caden said thank you to Petra without looking up, either she noticed that and felt it, small and warm, the particular warmth of being in the same rhythm as another person, working in the same direction. She had not felt that in 3 years. She thought she might be willing to feel it now. She found the third person on a Thursday. It was the district supervisor, as she had guessed, but the mechanism was more sophisticated than she had expected. Not crude falsification, but a system of legitimate-looking transfers between accounts that required reading 4 documents simultaneously to see the pattern. She had spent most of Wednesday building a grid on a large piece of paper that she had gotten from the household records room by telling the clerk she needed it for household accounts, which was technically true in a very broad sense. By Thursday morning, the grid made the pattern visible, and she sat with it and looked at it for a while, and then she went and knocked on the door of Caden's study for the first time in 3 years. His secretary, a thin young man named Ward, who had always treated her with the careful politeness of someone who did not know what category she fell into, looked at her with visible surprise and said he would check if the Alpha King was available. She said, "Tell him Sarah has the third one." Ward went in. He came back out in approximately 15 seconds and held the door open. She went in. Caden's study was not what she had imagined. She had constructed a version of it in her head over 3 years. Something severe and official and arranged for the performance of authority. The reality was a large room that was clearly lived in, books pulled from shelves and not replaced, papers in organized stacks that suggested a system without being pristine, a desk that had been worked at rather than posed behind. He was standing when she came in, which she had not expected. He said, "Show me." She spread the grid on his desk. She explained the transfer system. He asked questions, good ones, and she answered them, and he stood on the other side of the desk and looked at what she had built, and she watched his face, and saw him arrive at the same conclusion she had arrived at that morning. the specific expression of understanding something that is clarifying and troubling at once. He said, "This is enough for a formal inquiry." She said, "It's enough for 3 formal inquiries." He looked up at her. He said, "How long did this take you?" She said, 11 days. He said, 11 days. She said, "I had the time." She said it without sharpness. It was simply true, and they both knew it was true, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. He held her gaze. He said, "Sarah." She waited. He said, "I owe you more than an apology." She said, "You don't owe me anything for the work. I did it because I wanted to." He said, "I know." He said, "I'm not talking about the work." She looked at the grid on his desk. She thought about 11 days of village returns, and the notebook, and the boundary discrepancy, and the east corridor, and the light under the door, and 3 years of evenings in a room with 2 chairs and one of them empty. She said, "I know what you're talking about." He came around the desk. Not quickly, not with the particular urgency that would have made her step back, but steadily, the way he did things when he had decided to do them. He stopped an arm's length away. He said, "I built a distance I didn't know how to cross, and I left you in it, and that is," he stopped. She waited. He said, "There isn't a word for what that is." She said, "There are several." He said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to know all of them, if you're willing to tell me." She said, "That might take a while." He said, "I have time." She looked at him, the face she had been looking at across fires and desks and long formal tables for 3 years. The face that had been so carefully composed, and was composed now too, but differently, with something visible beneath the composure that she recognized, because she had seen it twice before, once in the first month, and once in the corridor in the rain. The thing that was not authority or distance but was just him, the version of him that apparently required either weather or an emergency or 11 days of village returns to surface. She said, "I found 3 people stealing from 6 villages." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'd like to find out if there are more." He said, "I'd like you to." She said, "Together this time. Not me at the desk alone." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." Together she picked up her grid from his desk. She said, "I'll need the Northern District records next." He said, "I'll have them sent to your room this evening." She said, "Send them to the study." She looked around the room, the lived-in room that was not what she had imagined. She said, "There's more space here." He said nothing. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "And I'd like to know this room." He said, very quietly, "Yes." She crossed to the door. She paused. She said, "This evening, then," he said. "Yes." She went back to her room and sat at the window and looked at the forest and thought, 11 days, she thought. 1 rainy night, and a knocked door, and a chair that had never been sat in, and 11 days of village returns, and now the study. She thought about how many days were left from here, and what they might look like, and whether she was allowed to be, carefully, without rushing, without demanding it be more than it was yet, something close to hopeful. She decided she was. The Northern District records arrived at the study that evening. 4 stacks, substantial, delivered by Ward with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of the household arrangements. Sarah was already there when they arrived. She had moved her notebook and her pen and the grid to the large desk and pulled the second chair around to the working side, the side with the lamp, and she was reading through the first quarter of Northern Returns when Caden came in at his usual hour. He stopped when he saw her at his desk. She looked up. She said, "I hope this is," he said. "Yes." He came in. He sat in the second chair she had pulled around, their shoulders parallel, and looked at what she had spread across the desk. She showed him where she had gotten to. He picked up the adjacent document, and they worked. It was different in the study than in her room. In her room, the fire was the center, and the chairs faced it, and the work happened at the desk to one side. Here, the desk was the center, and everything organized around it, and the lamp threw a tighter circle of light, and they were closer by necessity, the desk requiring it. And she was aware of the closeness without it requiring management, which was itself a change from other kinds of closeness she had navigated over the years. The performative closeness of public functions and the managed distance of everything else. This was neither. This was two people bent over documents with their shoulders near each other and their attention on the same thing, and it was, she found, the most natural she had felt in this palace in 3 years. He said, around the second hour, "Here." She leaned to look at what he was pointing at, a figure in the margin of a district summary, handwritten in a different ink from the printed amounts. She said, "That's an adjustment entry." He said, "It's not recorded anywhere else in the quarter." She said, "Which means it's off book. Which means," he said, "someone made a correction they didn't want documented." She said yes. She looked at the figure. She said, "It's the same amount as the rate discrepancy in the first district." He looked at her. She said, "Not the same district. The same amount." He said, "A transfer." She said, "Between collectors." She sat back. She said, "They're connected. Not just aware of each other, the same system." He said, "How wide?" She said, "I don't know yet, but wider than we thought." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking beside her, the particular quality of his silence when he was working something through rather than composing himself. She had learned to distinguish them. He said, "This started before the current collector appointments." She said yes. "I think it did," he said, "which means whoever designed it is still in the palace." She said, "Very likely." He looked at the document. He said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need you to understand something." She waited. He said, "What you are doing, what you have built in 11 days with village returns and a notebook." He stopped. He said, "There are people on my council who have not done this in 20 years of trying." She said, "They weren't looking at both documents." He said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "That's not what I'm saying." She said, "What are you saying?" He said, "I'm saying I have been sitting across a fire from the wrong version of this arrangement for 3 years, and He stopped." She said, quietly, kept walking past the door. He said, "Yes." She looked at the lamp. She said, "Why tonight?" She meant the first night, the rain, and he knew she meant it. He said, "Because the roof collapsed, and I was in the east corridor anyway, and the light was under your door, and I had been." He stopped. He said, "I had been standing outside that door in my head for a long time." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the desk. He said, "It took a roof and a rainstorm to make me actually knock." She said, "That's very dramatic." He said, "Yes." He said it with something she had not heard in his voice before. Something dry and self-aware. Something that was almost humor at his own expense. She said, "I'm glad the roof collapsed." He looked at her. She said, "Not the horses. I hope the horses are all right." He said, "They are." All 3 came back. She nodded. She looked at the documents. She said, "We should find the connection point, the person who designed the system." He said yes. She picked up her pen. He picked up the adjacent document. The lamp burned between them, and the palace was quiet, and somewhere outside the last of the rain was doing something gentle against the high windows, and she was, without deciding to be, content. Not the fragile kind that came from gratitude for small mercies. The kind that had a foundation under it. She worked, and he worked beside her, and it was nothing like 3 years. And it was also, somehow, the beginning of what 3 years should have been, and she thought that beginnings did not always arrive at the beginning. Sometimes they arrived in the rain at midnight, with a man standing in a corridor who had finally decided to knock. She found the architect of the system on a Saturday, not in the records room itself, in the filing system, in a gap that should not have existed between 2 consecutive document numbers in the official register, a gap that meant something had been removed, and when she followed the gap, it led her to a name she recognized because she had seen it at the formal dinners, at the council table, in the corridor outside the study when she had first come to knock. The name was Aldrich Vane. He was the palace treasurer. He had been the palace treasurer for 11 years, and he had been building this system, slowly and carefully, for at least 8 of those 11 years, layering it with enough legitimacy that you could read any single part of it and see nothing wrong. You had to read everything at once to see the shape. She sat in the records room for a long time after she understood it. She was thinking about how to tell Caden, not whether to tell him. There was no question of whether, but how. Because this was not a village collector or a district supervisor. This was someone he had sat beside at council for years. Someone he had trusted with the treasury. She went to the study. He was there already, which was where he was now in the mornings. Both of them had shifted without discussing the shift, the mornings in the study and the evenings in the study, and the chairs pulled to the working side of the desk. He looked up when she came in and saw her face and said nothing, which was the right thing, giving her room to arrive at the words in her own order. She sat. She said, "It's Aldrich Vane." He was still. She said, "The full system. He designed it. He's been running it through the collector network for at least 8 years. He said, very quietly, "Show me." She showed him. She had brought the documents, the register gap, the cross-references, the trail that led back to a single point of origin. He read everything. He read it more carefully than she had ever seen him read anything, which was saying something, because he read most things with thoroughness. When he finished, he set the documents down. He did not speak immediately. She watched his face and saw something moving through it that was difficult to watch, not because it was frightening, but because it was real in the way that faces rarely were at council tables. A person finding out that someone they trusted had been something other than what they appeared for a very long time. She said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her. He said, "Don't apologize." She said, "It's not an apology. It's..." She stopped. He said, "I know what it is." He looked at the documents. He said, 8 years. She said, "Possibly more." He said, he stopped. She said, gently, "While you were managing everything else." He looked at her. He said, "That is more charitable than I deserve." She said, "It's accurate." He said, "I should have had someone looking at both documents." She said, "Yes." He said, "I should have had you looking at both documents." She said quietly, "You didn't know I could." He said, "I didn't ask." She held his gaze. She said, "No." He said, "That is a failure of a different kind." He said it the way he said true things now, directly, without the composure performing work it didn't need to perform. She said, "Yes. It is." He looked at the documents again. He said, "This will need to be handled carefully. The evidence is thorough." He said the last part with something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it, something warm and deliberate. She said, "The evidence is thorough." He looked at her and said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. He said, "After this, after the inquiry and the replacements and the system is rebuilt properly." He stopped. She said, "Yes." He said, "I want this to continue." She said, "The records work." He said, "Everything." He said it simply, without drama, which was how he said things that mattered. She looked at him across the desk they had been sharing for 2 weeks, the desk she had come to think of as the desk rather than his desk, and she thought about the study and the chairs and the rain and the collapsed roof and a man who had been standing outside a door in his head for a long time before he knocked. She said, "It already is continuing." He said, "I know." He said, "I want to be clear that I know." She said, "You're being very formal about it." Something crossed his face, the dry self-aware thing, the almost humor. He said, "I've been told that before." She said, "By your brother." He said, "And now, by you." She said, "It means you're feeling something and you're handling it like a treasury document." He was quiet. Then he said, "You're probably right." She said, "I usually am." He looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to file away and started simply receiving, warm and undefended and entirely his. He said, "Yes." He said, "You are." The inquiry took 3 weeks. Sarah was present for most of it, not officially, not at the formal sessions where the council gathered with their documents and their serious faces and their awareness that something significant had happened. She was present in the study, before and after each session, where Caden came back and told her what had been said, and she told him what it meant relative to the documents, and they built the formal record together. The two of them at the desk, with the lamp and the stacks of evidence she had organized by district and year-end collector. Aldrich Vane was removed from his position in the 2nd week. He did not contest the evidence. She had made it uncontestable. The network was identified across 9 districts and 14 collectors and 2 district supervisors and 1 treasury clerk who had been the mechanism of the account transfers. Each piece of it was documented and filed and cross-referenced, and she had built a summary ledger that laid it out clearly enough that the council could read it in a single session, which several of them did, and which produced, according to Caden, a silence that lasted approximately 2 minutes before anyone spoke. Ward told her separately that it was the longest council silence he had witnessed in 6 years of being in the room for them. She spent the 3rd week building the recommendation document, the outline of how the system should be restructured to prevent the same pattern from developing again, the oversight mechanisms that had been missing, the cross-referencing requirement that would make the rate manipulation visible in real time rather than 11 days after the fact, with village returns and a notebook. She drafted it at the study desk, and Caden read it section by section as she finished each one, and they argued about 2 sections, genuinely argued, which was something she had not expected to enjoy as much as she did. He thought the cross-referencing requirement was too burdensome for small districts with limited administrative staff. She thought he was wrong, and said so. He explained his reasoning. She explained hers. They went back and forth for 40 minutes and arrived at a version that was neither her original nor his objection, but something that had come from both, which was, she thought, better than either. He said when they had it, "You were right about the threshold." She said, "You were right about the small districts." He said, "We were both right." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to do this more often." She said, "Argue." He said, "Reach something better than either of us started with." She looked at the document. She said, "So would I." He said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. She was good at waiting, but it was different now. The waiting, it did not have the quality of bracing for disappointment that it had carried for 3 years. It had a different quality, something open, expecting to receive rather than expecting to deflect. He said, I asked you, that first night, why you let me in. She said, you needed the stable master's room number. He said, I didn't need the stable master's room number. She said, I know. He said, why did you let me in? She thought about it. She said, because you were wet. He said, that's the reason. She said, it was raining. She said, and because you had been walking past that door for 3 years, and I had been sitting on the other side of it, and I was, she stopped. He waited. She said, I was tired of the door. He said, yes. He said, so was I. He looked at the document they had built together, the restructuring plan, the thing that would change how 9 districts worked and 14 collection routes operated and 2 levels of oversight functioned going forward. He said, you did this in 3 weeks. She said, we did this. He said, you started it. She said, you let me into the study. He said, you knocked. She said, you opened the door. He looked at her with the expression that was warm and undefended, and she looked back at him, and she thought about all the doors, her door in the rain, and his study door, and the door she had knocked on that Thursday with the grid in her hand, and the doors that were opening now that she did not yet have names for. She said, the northern districts still need to be audited, the records from before the system was established. He said, I know. She said, that will take months. He said, yes. He said, we have months. She said, we have more than that. He looked at her. She looked back. She said, I'm not going anywhere. He said quietly, I know. She said, I want you to know that I know. He said, yes. He reached across the desk. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He put his hand over hers on the desk, large and steady, and held it the way you hold something you are not planning to let go of, with patience rather than grip, with the specific quality of someone who has learned the difference. She turned her hand and held his back. The lamp burned. The palace was quiet around them. 3 weeks ago, she had been sitting at her window in a room with 2 chairs and 3 years of accumulated distance, and now she was here, in the study that was theirs, with records to audit and months ahead of them and a hand in hers, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something that should have been allowed to begin finally begins. Spring came to the Northern Territories later than anywhere else. Sarah knew this from the village returns, from 3 weeks of reading about crops and harvest times, and the particular rhythm of communities that lived north enough that winter was not a season, but a condition, something that shaped everything else around it. She knew it from the records before she knew it from the window, and when she looked out the study window one morning in early spring and saw the first tentative warmth in the courtyard stones, the snow retreating from the lower edges, the river somewhere beyond the walls beginning to sound different, she felt the recognition of something she had already understood in numbers now becoming visible, as fact. She told Caden this when he came in. She said, the northern districts will start their planting cycle in about 6 weeks. He looked at the window. He said, yes. She said, which means the first quarter returns under the new oversight system will come in around midsummer. He said, you're already planning the audit cycle. She said, I've been planning it since the 3rd. He said, of course you have. There was warmth in it. She had gotten used to the warmth, which was not the same as taking it for granted. She did not take it for granted. She had 3 years of evenings as a reference point for what the alternative felt like, and she intended to keep that reference point accessible as a reminder of what this was relative to what it had been. He sat in the chair beside her at the desk, which was simply where he sat now, not across from her, beside her, the chairs pulled parallel to the working side. He had a letter he had been drafting to the Eastern Council, something about the restructuring, and he read her a section, and asked what she thought, and she said what she thought, and he made a note in the margin, and the morning continued. Ward knocked at 10 and came in with tea and set it between them without expression, although she had noticed over the past weeks that Ward had gone from the careful politeness of uncertain category to something that looked, in an administrative aid sort of way, like approval. She had not commented on this. She poured the tea. She gave 1 cup to Caden. He took it without looking up from the letter, which was something she had noticed they did now. The small automatic things that happened between people who were in the same rhythm, and she thought about what her father would say if he saw her in this study at this desk, with the Alpha King beside her taking tea without looking up. Her father had spent 20 years in the border territories, navigating the machinery of power with the specific wariness of someone who understood that power was not interested in being navigated. He would probably say, "How?" She would say, "I found a discrepancy in a rate schedule." He would look at her for a moment, and then he would say, "That sounds like you." She missed her father. She thought about writing to him, not about the inquiry, about the study and the desk and the spring coming slowly to the Northern Territories. She had written to her mother 3 weeks ago, and had not yet written to her father because what she would write to her father was harder to find the right words for. He was a practical man. He would want the practical version. The practical version was, "The arrangement has changed. The reason it has changed is that I found a discrepancy in a rate schedule and followed it for 11 days and then knocked on a door." Her father would understand that. He would understand that some doors required a reason to knock on, and some reasons were discrepancies in rate schedules, and that what happened after you knocked was not always what you expected. She picked up her pen. She started the letter to her father. Caden was reading his letter beside her, and the tea was warm, and the spring was outside the window doing its slow work on the courtyard stones. And she wrote, in the practical terms her father would understand, that she was well, that the palace was not what she had understood it to be, that she had been given access to records she had found useful, that she intended to continue finding them useful for a considerable time. She paused. She added, "I have learned that some distances look like architecture, but are actually just the absence of a knock." She read it back. She left it in. Caden looked over at some point and said, "What are you writing?" She said, "Letter to my father." He said, "What does it say?" She said, "That I'm well." He said, "Is that all?" She said, "And that some distances are just the absence of a knock." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you think he'll understand that?" She said, "He spent 20 years as a border merchant. He understands that the thing standing between you and what you need is usually a conversation you haven't had yet." Caden looked at his letter. He said, "I should have met your father before now." She said, "Probably." He said, "I'd like to." She said, "He'll ask you about the Treasury restructuring." He said, "Good." He said, "I'd like to talk about it with someone who understands rate manipulation from the merchant side." She looked at him. He was looking at his letter, and there was something easy in his posture that had not been there 3 months ago, something that had to do with 2 chairs pulled to the same side of a desk and tea given without looking up, and a spring that was arriving slowly, but was arriving. She said, "Caden." He looked at her. She said, "I'm glad you knocked." He held her gaze. He said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "So am I." He said, "I should have knocked 3 years ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "I intend to make up for it." She said, "You already are." He said, "I intend to keep doing it." She said, "Good." She went back to her letter. He went back to his. The spring continued outside the window, and the tea cooled, and the morning went on, and she thought, finishing the letter to her father, that this was the shape of a life that was being built rather than inherited, assembled from discrepancies in village returns and rain, and knocked doors and 2 chairs on the same side of a desk. And that building it was, to her considerable surprise, the most interesting thing she had done in 21 years. The summer audit confirmed everything she had predicted. The first quarter returns under the new oversight system came in at midsummer, all 9 northern districts, and she and Caden spent 4 days reading them against the new cross-reference requirement and the rate schedule she had standardized in the restructuring document, and what they found was clean. Not perfect. There were 2 small discrepancies that turned out to be recording errors rather than manipulation, which she could tell from the pattern, and which she noted and had corrected, but clean in the sense that the systematic theft was gone. The network was gone. The gap between what villages paid and what the palace received had closed to within the margin of legitimate variation. She sat with the final tally on a warm summer morning in the study, with the window open and the courtyard sounds coming in, and she felt something she had not felt at the end of the inquiry, which had felt like resolution. This felt like proof. The inquiry resolved something that had been wrong. This proved that what they had built in its place was right. Caden came in at his usual time and she showed him the tally without preamble. He read it. He said, "Clean." She said, "Clean." He said, "All 9 districts." She said, "All 9." He set the document down. He looked at her. He said, "You built this." She said, "We built the oversight system." He said, "You saw what was missing." She said, "You let me look." He said, "Sarah," she said, "I know what you're going to say." He said, "Do you?" She said, "You're going to say something that is accurate, but that you're going to say more carefully than it needs to be said, because that's what you do when something matters to you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know me." She said, "Yes." He said, "When did that happen?" She said, "Somewhere around the boundary discrepancy." He said, "The 1870 notation equivalent." She said, "Yes." He looked at the tally. He said, "I want to tell you something directly." He paused. "Without being careful," she said. He said, "Yes." She waited. He said, "I have spent 3 years being careful about things that did not require care and careless about things that required everything." He said, "I was careful about the distance and careless about you." She held his gaze. She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm not going to be careless about you again." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to know that I know that's not enough to say." She said, "It's a start." He said, "Yes." He came around the desk, not the way he had come around it the night he had put his hand over hers, careful and steady. He came around it the way he had learned to move in this room over months of mornings, naturally, without ceremony, the way you move towards something that is yours. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "The rooms." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want them to not be separate anymore." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very careful way of saying something that doesn't require care." He exhaled, almost a laugh, the real kind. She had been collecting his real laughs over the summer, rare still but real, and she found each one significant in the way of things that are rare and therefore worth noting. He said, "Will you come to my room?" She said, "Yes." She said, "I've been waiting for you to ask." He said, "I know." He said, "I should have asked." She said, "You're asking now." He said, "Yes." She stood. She was exactly the height that required her to look up at him slightly, which she had gotten used to, and which she found, privately, less difficult than she had expected to find it. The looking up. Because looking up at someone who was looking at you the way he looked at her was not the same as looking up at someone looking down. He looked at her the way she had come to know he looked, with the full attention that was his particular form of care, with the warmth that was no longer underneath the composure, because the composure had learned to make room for it. She said, "There are still 4 southern districts to audit." He said, "I know." She said, "And the annual levy cycle starts in the fall." He said, "Yes." She said, "We have a great deal of work to do." He said, "Yes." He said, "We have a great deal of time to do it in." She said, "Yes." She said, "We do." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the rain, and the knocked door, and the chair that had never been sat in, and the village returns, and the boundary discrepancy, and the distance that had looked like architecture, and turned out to be something that could be crossed, had been crossed, was still being crossed, every day, in the accumulated small currency of 2 chairs on the same side of a desk, and tea given without. Looking up, and letters to fathers and clean tallies at midsummer. She thought about how far they were from a rainy night 3 months ago, and how far there was still to go, and that the going was, she had decided, somewhere in the spring, the thing she was most interested in. He took her hand. She held it. They went to his room, which was going to become their room, which was a door she was walking through, with full knowledge of what she was walking toward, and no qualification attached. No yes but and no probably not. Just yes. Just this. Just the next thing in a life that was being built room by room and record by record, and knocked door by knocked door into something that was at last exactly the right size. Outside, the summer palace was warm, and the northern mountains were green for their brief season, and somewhere in 9 clean districts the villages were beginning their harvest cycle, and the numbers would come in right, and she would read them, and he would read them beside her, and it would be, in the way of all the best things, unremarkable. Just 2 people in the same room, in the same rhythm, doing work that mattered, holding on.